In August 1590, English Governor John White expected his long journey across the Atlantic to end in a reunion. He was finally returning to the North American settlement he had left 3 years prior, eager to see the families waiting for him, including his daughter and a newborn granddaughter named Virginia Dare. But as White and his men approached the Roanoke encampment, the voices they expected to hear never materialized. The settlement was completely abandoned. There were no bodies, no discarded weapons, and no obvious signs of a stubble. The colonists had been swallowed by silence. Left behind in the ruins was a single piece of evidence. Carved carefully into a wooden palisade post was a cryptic word, Croatoan. White recognized the word as a reference to an island and an indigenous community farther south, but deteriorating weather forced his ship away before he could investigate. The families were never seen by English eyes again, leaving a historical void that quickly filled with a 400-year-old ghost story about 117 people evaporating into thin air. For centuries, that void has been crowded with sensational folklore. Popular narratives often lean on sudden massacres, catastrophic plagues, or supernatural events to explain how the settlement was erased. Yet treating the Roanoke settlement as a sudden, inexplicable vanishing ignores the physical evidence left behind at the site. Understanding what happened to these people requires moving past the ghost story to examine the brutal, practical mechanics of colonial isolation. The evidence suggests these 117 people made a calculated, desperate decision to survive. To see how they reached that decision, we must look back to 1587. This specific expedition was composed of families, farmers, and craftsmen expecting to build a permanent community. They were not a self-sufficient military unit. They immediately faced severe environmental realities upon arrival. The expedition arrived late in the season, critically short on necessary supplies, and stepped directly into a documented regional drought that made crop cultivation nearly impossible. The English were entering a landscape already occupied. They were surrounded by indigenous Algonquin communities whose trust had been shattered by previous, violent military expeditions. Facing starvation and navigating a hostile geopolitical landscape, the colonists reached a practical consensus. Governor John White would return to England solely to gather emergency provisions for the struggling families. White set sail, expecting a brief turnaround. Instead, this temporary supply run inadvertently severed the colony's only lifeline to the outside world. When White reached Europe, he found a continent at war. England was facing an existential threat from the approaching Spanish Armada. Queen Elizabeth's government immediately redirected all English shipping and naval resources to defend the homeland. Every vessel was needed for the war effort. Beyond the war, there was the overwhelming physical barrier of the Atlantic. Traversing thousands of miles of unpredictable, storm-battered water was nearly impossible. The combination of international conflict and the logistics of ocean travel transformed a few months of waiting into a fatal 3-year separation. John White's documentation from 1590 provides a specific set of physical markers that reconstruct what happened in his absence. First, there was an absence of bodies. White found no skeletal remains, no disturbed earth, and no mass graves anywhere near the settlement. Second, the fort's structures were not burned or randomly destroyed. They had been systematically dismantled and removed, indicating a planned, orderly relocation rather than chaotic flight. Third, the word Croatoan was the prearranged destination signal the colonists had agreed to leave. It pointed south toward a specific island and a specific indigenous community. Finally, White searched for a Maltese cross. The colonists had agreed to carve this symbol if forced to leave under violent attack. No cross was found anywhere at the site. This physical evidence directly contradicts the theory of a sudden massacre. Instead, it points toward a deliberate, logical migration by a community moving toward a known ally. 4 centuries of digging has failed to produce a single intact settlement that can be conclusively identified as the lost colony. The landscape itself hides the truth. Over generations, shifting barrier islands, rising sea levels, and severe coastal erosion have physically erased the historical geography. Yet modern archaeologists are uncovering 16th-century European artifacts mixed deep within established indigenous sites. Digital analysis of John White's map revealed a hidden fort symbol in the inland areas, 50 miles from Roanoke. This is the same region researchers are discovering these objects. This scattered artifact record isn't a failure to find the colony. It is the actual footprint of their survival. A political colony can disappear while its people survive. Rather than staying together as a single English entity, the settlers likely fractured and blended into the local populations. To avoid starvation, these families had to adapt. They likely shed English garments for local materials, learned Algonquian dialects, and adopted regional agricultural practices to fit the landscape. Over the following decades, these survivors would have intermarried and raised children. These children grew up identifying with their new communities, their English ancestry becoming just one part of a complex heritage. The historical record lost track of the colonists because they ceased to exist as an English settlement. This is the history of a community trading its national identity for its literal survival, vanishing from the English record by quietly entering another.